Dusk Pages. The Vanishing of the Atkinsons by Eric Brown. It is more than likely that 1888 was also the year of The Hound of the Baskervilles, perhaps Holmes's most famous case, and not a decade later as popularly recorded. Holmes was initially unable to venture to Dartmoor and sent Watson in his stead. Holmes claimed he was involved in a blackmail case, which may be true. But it is also likely that he was being consulted over the Jack the Ripper murders. There have been many attempts to account for Holmes's involvement in that investigation, all of them, I believe, apocryphal. It is my belief that Holmes rapidly solved those murders to his own satisfaction and left Scotland Yard to bring the investigation to a conclusion, so that he could throw himself fully into the Baskerville problem. Also at the time was the case, The Sign of Four, in which Watson met and fell in love with Mary Morstan. They were married soon after, at the close of 1888. Watson moved out of the Baker Street apartments and also set himself up in a practice in Paddington. For a while Holmes continued his investigations on his own, and it was not until March 1889 that the two were reunited in A Scandal in Bohemia. Watson only later came to learn of some of the cases that Holmes investigated on his own. Amongst them was the tragedy of the Atkinson brothers. Although Watson later wrote this up, he never sought its publication. Some years ago, a copy of this came to my attention, and my colleague, Eric Brown, has made it suitable for publication. I had not seen my friend Sherlock Holmes for some months. Pressure of work on both our parts curtailing the niceties of social intercourse. And it was quite by chance that he happened to be in his chambers when I called upon him that evening. "Watson," Holmes declared as Mrs. Hudson showed me into the room. "Take a seat, my friend. I trust the winter is not too inclement for you." I warmed my hands before the fire, and then accommodated myself in the proffered armchair. I made some comment or other to the effect that the winters were becoming even colder of late, which set my friend on the course of a lengthy speculation upon the subject of world meteorology, climatology, and allied topics. I helped myself to a brandy and settled in for the evening. My interest quickened. It is the one regret of our friendship that Holmes rarely sees fit to avail me of the incidents that befell him during his sojourn to Points East during the period I have termed, in my accounts of my friend's illustrious career, the great hiatus. That night he was vague in the details of his travels, but at one point he'd say, "Of course I had experience of the monsoon when I traveled from Tibet south to Ceylon to revisit an old friend." I leaned forward, pouncing upon his use of the word revisit. "Why, Holmes, do you mean to say that you visited the island before '94? My friend realized his mistake at once and gestured with feigned unconcern. "A trifling affair at Trincomalee in '88. You actually worked on a case out there?" I expostulated. "But why haven't you mentioned this before?" "An affair of little account and even less interest, Watson. And anyway, I was sworn to utmost secrecy by the Royal Ceylonese Tea Company. As I was saying, concerning the nature of the monsoon rains, whereupon the affair at Trincomalee, dismissed by my friend in his desire to expound upon the subject of the Asiatic rains. Towards midnight, I took my leave. During the course of the next few weeks, went about my business, with hardly a thought for that evening's exchange. I had quite forgotten about the affair when, 1 month later, I called upon my friend and found him at home. He showed me to the fire and urged to help myself to a snifter of brandy At length he gestured with a long, languid hand to a letter lying open on the table, beside his chair. "Do you recall that upon your last visit, I mentioned a small affair at Trincomalee, Ceylon, and the injunction placed upon my mentioning the case by the Royal Ceylonese Tea Company?" I sat up, quite excited. "Of course," said I. "But what of it?" "It appears that the injunction no longer pertains, Watson," Holmes said casually. "3 weeks ago I received a letter from my friend out there, informing me that the company has fallen upon bad times and gone bankrupt. And so the last obstacle to my telling of the tale is no more." He proceeded to fill his pipe with tobacco from the battered slipper he kept wedged down the side of his armchair. Soon we were enveloped in a pungent blue fug. I took a sip of brandy and made myself an audience, as I had on many an occasion before, to my friend's oratorical skills. You recall the extraordinary case of the Gloria Scott, wherein I was called to the aid of my university friend, Victor Trevor? "I most certainly do," I said. It had been one of the cases I had written up during Holmes' long absence from these shores. "For many years," he said, "I lost contact with Trevor. At length I heard through a mutual friend that he had set sail for Ceylon, with the idea of managing a tea plantation or some such, whatever. No more. That is, till the year of '88, when I received a letter from my old friend, couched such terms that made it obvious he was in need of my assistance. Indeed, he almost begged my presence on that far-away island, and even went so far as to include a return ticket on a cutter of the East India Line and promise of payment for my troubles upon my arrival. He went on to outline the details of a case that had baffled himself and his employers, the Royal Ceylonese Tea Company, for a good 3 months. Those details I found curious enough, and the pleas of my friend sufficient to warrant a trip to those tropical latitudes. You probably never missed me, my dear Watson, being too occupied with other things at the time. It was shortly after your marriage that I put my affairs in order, packed my bags, and set sail aboard the Eastern Empress. For the duration of the voyage, I absorbed myself in the analysis of the details of the case presented to me in Trevor's somewhat hasty missive. The brothers Atkinson, Bruce and William, were neighbors of Victor Trevor in Ceylon. They had left England some 10 years before, and set sail for the Far East with the intention of making their fortunes. For a decade they worked for the Royal Ceylonese Tea Company at various locations around the island, for the last 2 years managing an estate of some 100 native workers near Trincomalee. They were by all accounts gentlemen of upstanding and personable character, well liked by both the Ceylonese and the expatriate community of fellow planters and other businessmen. My friend Victor Trevor was a regular social visitor to the plantation. In his own words, the brothers were the salt of the earth. They never married, a situation not uncommon among those of their chosen vocation, and lived for their work. They had no enemies. Their disappearance was as sudden as it was mysterious. It occurred presumably in the early hours of one February. Suffice to say, they were seen by their houseboy prior to turning in the night before, but in the morning they were gone. They did not appear for breakfast at 6, nor show up to do their rounds of the plantation at 7. Their absence was reported to the colonial police at Trincomalee at 9 o'clock that morning, and it was not until noon that my friend Trevor heard of their disappearance. He headed over to the plantation and arrived minutes before a sergeant from the police. Together they searched the house and found nothing to suggest anything amiss other than a broken gas lamp and an overturned table in the lounge room. The investigating officer suggested that these were suspicious, indicative of a struggle and foul play. But Trevor noted that the table had been positioned near an open window through which the wind disturbed a heavy curtain. It was conceivable that the wind had caused the damage. They searched the plantation and even the neighboring country, but found nothing and no one. They questioned the undermanagers and local workers, who reported nothing suspicious or noteworthy. From that day, 1 February 1887, to the day Trevor penned the letter, the brothers Atkinson had neither been seen nor heard. It was as if they left the house that morning and vanished from the face of the earth. Of course, Trevor's account was selective and inconclusive. There was much that I wished to know of the affairs of the brothers before I might begin to give an opinion on the case. By the time the Eastern Empress docked at the port of Jaffna, I was eager to set about my investigations. Victor Trevor met me on the quay, and we drove south in his trap to Trincomalee. The passage of time had done little to take the shine off the youth of my university friend, and for the duration of the journey we exchanged information concerning our exploits during the intervening years. I was to stay at the Atkinsons' plantation itself, which Trevor was overseeing in the absence of the brothers. It was late by the time we arrived, and I had little time to question my friend as to the details of the case before he suggested that we turn in and discuss the reason for my presence in the morning. The miracle of dawn in those climes. Watson. I was up early the following morning to witness the rapid transformation from night to day from my veranda. 1 minute the land was clothed in darkness, the next a golden sunlight exposed the deep shadows of the valleys and the bright green expanse of the tea bushes. My friend was already risen, and we partook breakfast, excellent kippers and poached eggs, around the vast oak table of the dining room. I see the brothers Atkinson were fond of a game of cards, I observed, gesturing to the tabletop. Bridge, if I am not mistaken. Your powers of deduction are as sharp as ever, Trevor remarked. Recall how you amazed my father upon that first meeting? Now, an explanation, if you please. Simplicity itself. Observe the marks of wear upon the polish of the tabletop. Note the scuff mark, where a hand would be picked up, and the two smaller indentations at either side of where the pack resides at the center of the table, made when the pack would be lifted at the end of a hand. Remarkable. Further, 3 of the 4 players are right-handed, the 4th not so. This much is obvious from the slight grooves in the patina of the polish, worn either to the right or left of the player. You are left-handed, Victor, and I deduce therefore that you were a frequent guest on bridge nights. Twice a week for the past 2 years, Holmes, said he, shaking his head. I can tell, also, that penny bets were placed upon the outcome of the games. The scratches here and here attest to that. At this my friend colored. Why, he blustered. You're right, Holmes. A little wager added interest to the contests. I am not a gambling man myself, I said. I find that the scientific analysis of the pursuit results in the fact that one can never win, only break even, except when luck intervenes, and I have never been one to trust in the happy felicity of luck. We finished our breakfast, and I asked then to be shown around the house, and expressed the desire to question the Atkinsons' head houseboy and housekeeper. Victor showed me into the lounge, a spacious room affording him a magnificent panorama across the sun-soaked terraces of the estate. Hanging above the fireplace was an oil painting of the brothers, tall, flaxen-haired men in the middle 30s, posing with their rifles on either side of a prostrate tiger. I have left everything in place, as found on the morning of the brothers' disappearance. Observe the table and gas lamp. As Trevor had mentioned in the letter, there were no suspicious circumstances to be drawn from the toppled table and lamp. A wind stirring the curtains through the open window might easily have occasioned the damage. Were the doors locked upon the night of the disappearance? I asked. It is uncommon in these parts to take the precaution of locking doors. If we trust our staff, then we see no need. We passed through the house from room to room, and I noticed nothing amiss or noteworthy as we did so. At length we stood upon the veranda and gazed out over the verdant hills of the estate. Tell me, Victor, were the brothers in the habit of taking hikes or taking off on travels without notifying friends and staff? Most certainly not. They had the interests of the estate at heart. They were most conscientious in the running of the business. They would go nowhere without first notifying one of their managers. Twice a year, they took a boat up to Madras to call on acquaintances for a week, at Christmas, and again 6 months later at the end of June. So therefore their disappearance in February cannot have been simply a trip to Madras. Of course not. We checked this possibility at the shipping office in Trincomalee. Which company did the brothers use for their voyages to India? The Madras line. They have offices in town. I might call upon them myself in the course of my investigation, said I. The houseboy was summoned from the kitchen, and I questioned him upon the veranda. The houseboy proved to be no boy at all, but a tiny, wizened Tamil in his 50s at least. He was polite and informative, but could shed no light on the mysterious vanishing of his employers. I ran the gamut of usual questions, from whether he noticed anything amiss on the night in question. He had not, to whether the brothers were liked and respected, which they were. Finally I asked, what, in your opinion, has become of Master Bruce and William? At this his eyes filled with tears, and he murmured, I fear for their lives, Mr. Holmes. You do, and why is this? The little Tamil shook his head. Their spirits are abroad at night, said he. I exchanged a glance with Trevor. They are. And what makes you so certain? Myself, I have not heard or seen them. My kitchen boys report hearing their wails in the night from the hills around. Their spirits haunt the estate and will do so until their enemies are brought to justice. I considered his words for some minutes, my thoughts entertaining dark possibilities in the bright sunlight of that equatorial country, whereupon I dismissed the houseboy and turned to Trevor. And what, my friend, do you make of that? Poppycock Holmes. Superstition of the first water. There are no people on earth more given to such flights of fancy than the natives of this island. They probably heard the trumpeting of an elephant and drew conclusions. Perhaps I might have a word with the housekeeper. Trevor informed me that the girl employed by the brothers at the time of their disappearance was no longer in service here. She is pregnant, and shortly after the brothers' disappearance took ill. For the past 3 months, she has been bedridden in a bungalow on the edge of the estate. The brothers hired a doctor in the early stages of her pregnancy, when she first signs of weakness. The doctor has attended her ever since. Later, if you wish, we might visit her and see what she can add to your investigations. Now, perhaps I could show you around the estate before the sun is at its height. I have my morning rounds to do anyway. If you would care to join me, we took a trap along the rutted tracks, excavated through the red soil of the estate. From time to time Trevor reined the horse to a halt, climbed down and engaged native workers in long minutes conversation. 1 hour before noon, with the sun beating down like some heavenly furnace, Trevor pulled up on the very perimeter of the estate, jumped down and strode through the knee-high bushes to address a worker bent over in inspection of the soil. While Trevor was thus occupied, and despite the fierce attention of the sun, I elected to leave the canopied shade of the trap and take a stroll. I inspected a number of tea plants, about which, over the course of my botanical investigations, I have come to know a little, At length I repaired to Trevor's side, interested in the involved conversation he was conducting with the worker. They were discussing the state and composition of the soil. At one point he interrupted. "Might this account for the state of the plants in this area?" inquired. "I didn't know you were a botanist too, Holmes," said Trevor. "I've gleaned a passing knowledge of the science in my reading over the years," said I. "And these plants seem, if I am not mistaken, to be suffering from Elsinothea, or mottle scab." The manager nodded. "And not only in this area, Mr. Holmes. Fully half the estate is blighted." Trevor swung his arm to indicate a broad swath of land on the periphery of the plantation. "The entire eastern sector will not produce this season," said he. "I closed down the whole area when I took charge in February, locked the outbuildings where the tea was stored for drying, and ensured that no one approached these terraces for fear of spreading the scab." "Do you think that the Atkinsons were aware of the disease before they vanished?" I asked. Trevor considered the question before replying. "It is possible, Holmes, indeed probable." He was silent while. "Why?" he asked at length. "Do you think that this might have some bearing on the case?" "It is too early to say," I opened. "But certainly it is a factor to be taken into consideration." We had been joined, there upon the hillside, by a knot of curious native workers. They spoke rapidly in their own tongue, Ceylonese, upon which Trevor seemed to lose his temper and snap at them in their language. They fell immediately silent and appeared shamefaced. "What were they saying?" I asked. "Yet more superstitious claptrap," Trevor said. "They claim that 6 months ago, just after Bruce and William vanished, they heard the waiting of their spirits in this benighted sector. Complete rubbish, of course." In due course we took our leave and drove east, towards the town of Trincomalee. The estate spreads over some 5 square miles, Trevor informed me. The easternmost area, bordering the town, is where the locals have their abodes. The Atkinsons' housekeeper interned in the hospital bungalow. Presently we came upon the hospital. But to grace the rude timber construct with such a title was optimistic in the extreme. It was little more than a shed occupied by 4 beds, only one of them taken. The doctor, an Indian in his 80s, showed us across to the girl. "One Anya Amala. 2 minutes only, sirs," he said. "The girl is most seriously weakened." She was a small thing barely out of her teens, with a sheen of perspiration laid across her dusky brow. She eyed our approach with something like apprehension, and as I took a seat beside the bed, I was at pains to put her at ease. "I wish only to ask a few simple questions," I began. "I will not detain you for long." She glanced like a frightened animal from the doctor to Trevor and finally back to myself. She nodded, licking her lips nervously. "How long have you worked for the brothers?" I inquired. In a whisper so soft it was almost inaudible, she said, "I have worked for William and Bruce almost 2 years, sir. They have been good and kind employers. I am most very upset when they disappear." "Workers on the estate are of the opinion that the brothers are dead, Anya. What do you think on this matter?" She shook her head, and the movement dislodged tears, which fell from her massive eyes and rolled brown cheeks. I cannot imagine this terrible thing." I patted her hand. There, we are doing all we can to resolve the situation." The doctor gestured that the girl had had enough, and after thanking her for her time we took our leave. We returned to the house and had lunch in the shade of the veranda, after which I retired to my room and slept in the heat of the day. Dinner that night was a formal occasion attended by a few local planters and their wives. The case, of course, was the main topic of conversation, and a dozen wild and extravagant theories were proposed to explain the state of affairs. "It is quite obvious to me," said one dowager, the wife of a retired planter, that the Atkinsons were facing a financial crisis and decided to abscond. They left like thieves in the night, and might at this very moment be enjoying the high life in Kuala Lumpur. Stuff and nonsense, someone responded. All the boats from the island have been investigated. The brothers were upon none of them. But you do concede, do you not, that the brothers were capable of such duplicity? An uneasy silence descended upon the gathered company. It is always unsettling to have suspicion pointed at erstwhile friends of hitherto impeccable reputation. Presently the conversation turned to matters colonial, and I excused myself and retired to my room. The following morning after breakfast, I told Trevor that I wished to visit Trincomalee, and he arranged a trap and driver to transport me there. Trincomalee is a small town with stone-built, colonial buildings dominating the main street, and ruder construction comprising the outskirts. I stepped down from the trap on the main street, which follows the length of the ridge for some 100 yards. I decided that my first port of call should be the Colonial Police Headquarters, an imposing building difficult to miss. After negotiating the interminable bureaucracy that maintains in such institutions, I was finally shown into the office of one Sergeant Mortimer, the officer in charge of the Atkinson investigation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising from his desk to shake my hand, "I heard that you were on the case. I must confess that I should be most grateful for any light you might shed on this dreadful matter. I don't mind confessing that the affair has me baffled." He dealt me a penetrating look. "Might I ask how your investigations proceed?" I told him that I had been on the island just over 1 day, and that thus far I had learnt little. "I would be pleased to hear your opinions on the case," I said. "There is a rumor doing the rounds that the Atkinsons' estate was falling, and rather than face the wrath of the owners, the brothers fled the country." The sergeant pursed his lips in contemplation. "Well, the estate was not doing that well, that much I can attest. But to be perfectly honest, I could not see the brothers taking the coward's way out and absconding. To cover that possibility, I had men posted at all the ports, 2 weeks following their disappearance. Have you, in the course of your investigations, looked into their financial situation?" "Of course. I made comprehensive inquiries at the local bank. They were overdrawn to the tune of some £1,000. The brothers— how can I put it? The brothers were rather fond of an occasional flutter, shall we say? By that I take it that they played and lost at cards." "So I have heard," Sergeant Mortimer said. "But I inquired as to whether they had outstanding gambling debts, and so far as I could discover, such was not the case. The whole affair baffles me, Mr. Holmes." "Might they have been taken from the house and murdered by enemies?" I suggested. "If they had enemies," the sergeant said, "then I might entertain the notion. But I knew the brothers well, and aside from their predilection towards gambling, they were as moral a pair as could be found. They did not have a detractor in the world." We discussed the matter further, but I discovered no more details relevant to the affair, and in due course I thanked the sergeant and took my leave. I decided to look in on the offices of the Madras Line, situated in a nearby weatherboard building. A harassed female clerk in a bright red sari barely glanced up at me as she busily copied out invoices. I introduced myself and stated my business. She was most brusque in her reply. "The ledgers are piled over there," she replied in the sing-song English of her people. "Why don't you look for yourself?" I bit my tongue and began the arduous business of going through the records of tickets sold during the relevant period. Needless to say, I discovered nothing. As if, I told myself, the brothers would have booked tickets under their own names. I returned to the unfriendly clerk and requested to see the manager. The woman looked up and smiled at me. "I am the manager, Mr. Holmes," said she. "In that case I would like to ask you a few questions, madam." For the next 10 minutes, I managed to extract answers from this impertinent soul. An operation as onerous as attempting to draw blood from a stone. For my pains, I learned that the brothers had not bought tickets from the Madras line since the Christmas before, when they had taken their customary week's holiday with friends in India. I thanked the manager for her estimable courtesy and stepped out into the street. I was about to return to the waiting trap, with little accomplished, when I noticed across the street the boarded-up windows of a building upon which a faded, painted sign advertised passenger ships to various destinations around the Indian subcontinent and Malaya. I entered the shop next door, a bicycle repair establishment, and asked how long the shipping office had been closed. The owner considered and duly answered that the business had gone into liquidation 6 months earlier. "Do you have any idea as to the whereabouts of its erstwhile manager?" I asked. "He is working as the deputy manager at the post office," I was told, and to these venerable premises I duly made my way. There, an ancient Tamil identified himself as the one-time proprietor of the shipping office. He proceeded to regale me with a catalogue of his mercantile misfortunes until I could redirect his conversation towards more germane matters. "I would surely have recalled if either of the Atkinsons had bought a ticket," he said, "especially in light of subsequent events." As I suspected, I murmured to myself, "Thank you for your time. However," he went on, "I do recall an occasion when someone from the Atkinsons' estate purchased 2 one-way tickets for Calcutta. I thought nothing of it at the time, though since I have wondered if it were at all relevant. Can you describe this person?" I asked. He shook his head with an effect of great sadness. "I am an old man, and my memory for faces fails me. However, I do recall that it was a young Sinhalese, and I wondered at the time an estate worker might come by funds enough to purchase 2 such tickets. Can you recall the departure date of these tickets?" I asked. "Now let me think," said the old man, rubbing his bristled chin. "Perhaps, if my memory serves me, around the middle of February." "The middle of February," I mused. "Just 2 weeks after the disappearance of the brothers Atkinson." I thanked this veritable sage for his information and made my way to the waiting trap, confident that at last my inquiries were bearing fruit. More news awaited me upon my return to the estate. It was late afternoon and Trevor was seated upon the veranda with the first drink of the day at his elbow. "Will you join me in a sundowner, Holmes?" said he. He dispatched a boy with orders to fetch a second drink. "And how went your inquiries?" "As well, if not better, than expected." I told him about the tickets purchased by the worker from this very estate. "In that case the affair is solved," Trevor cried. "The brothers left upon the boat bound for Calcutta." "I rather think not," said I. "You see, Sergeant Mortimer had men checking all the ships leaving the island for 2 weeks after their disappearance. Then, what the deuce became of them?" We sat in silence for some minutes before Trevor recalled that he had news to impart. "By the way, Holmes, you'll be glad to learn that the Anya girl gave birth at noon today. Mother and child fit and well. A little boy, so I'm told." I lowered my drink. "I would like to pay them another visit," I said. Trevor stared at me. "I didn't have you down as a sentimental type." He laughed. "I assure you that my interest is purely professional," I said. "I suggest that we make haste." Trevor eyed me dubiously. "Very well, Holmes, if you insist." He called the boy to ready the trap, and 5 minutes later we were rolling down the hillside towards the hospital bungalow. I took the opportunity to broach a rather delicate issue. "Trevor," said I, as my friend manhandled the reins and we rounded a sharp bend, "I learned today that the brothers were in debt, and moreover were rather partial to an occasional flutter." I recalled my friend's reaction the day before when I observed that their card games involved the exchange of money. I put it to you that you played the brothers at cards for more than mere pennies. Trevor stiffened. He would not even glance at me. Holmes. I should have known better than to hope you might not find out. How much did you win from them over the course of your encounters? Trevor huffed and puffed for some time before muttering, some £500, all told. Very well. That is all I wished to know. You obviously had an agreement, and after all the game was conducted between gentlemen. We continued the ride in uneasy silence. In due course we arrived at the hospital and hurried inside. The elderly doctor showed us to Anya's bed, beside which was a crib bearing the newborn baby. One glance at the infant was sufficient to confirm my suspicions. Beside me, Trevor gasped. Good God, man. I never thought the sleeping child had skin a tone lighter than his mother's, though that was not the clincher. The boy also possessed a fine head of luxuriant blonde curls. From the bed, Anya was staring at us, tears falling from her massive eyes. Bruce? I asked her, or William. It was some minutes before she could master her emotions and bring herself to reply. Young Master William, she said. We were in love. He promised that when our baby was born, we would go away, far from here, and start a new life together. She broke down in another fit of tears, and I glanced at Trevor. But does this have any bearing on their whereabouts? He asked. I think perhaps it might. I turned to the young girl. I take it, Anya, that you conducted your affair with William elsewhere than the house? She nodded, sobbing. At last she said, we met every second day, at 6, at the bungalow on Macpherson's Hill. To Macpherson's Hill at once, I said to Trevor. Anya grabbed my arm. William, Mr. Holmes, do you think? I feared the worst, but of course did not inform her. We can but hope and pray, I told her without conviction. We lost no time and hurried from the hospital. Trevor drove us at breakneck speed across the estate, each passing minute taking us higher and higher into the green-clad hills. I wish you'd tell me what you suspect, Holmes, he cried. I am almost beside myself with worry. It cannot be certain, I told him, but I rather think that all is far from well. We came upon a rise, and Trevor indicated a small timber bungalow situated 100 yards further along. He whipped the horse to greater speed, and seconds later we careered to a halt outside the bungalow. We jumped down and made our way into the building. I looked about the tiny sitting room, while Trevor reconnoitered the adjacent sleeping chamber. Holmes, came the sudden cry. I hurried into the bedroom and beheld, placed upon the counterpane in the center of the bed, a hastily scrawled note. I picked up the note and read it. Much as I supposed, I said to myself, passing Trevor the paper. He read it aloud. My dear Anya, make haste to Master Trevor with this note. Trevor, for God's sake help us. We were taken by bandits 3 mornings back. They hold us in the hills, demanding a ransom of some £500, to be left beside the well on Chatterjee Hill. If constables are present, they threaten to kill us. Trevor, I implore you, and we will reimburse you in due course. Please look after Anya until our release. Signed, William and Bruce Atkinson. But of course, said I, the day after the brothers disappeared, Anya fell ill and could not make the usual rendezvous. Good God, man, Trevor cried. What tragedy! They might lie dead with their throats cut as we speak. But what now? What now? Do I go ahead and deliver the ransom? I rather think that it is too late in the day for that, I said. The kidnappers have dispatched them already. I refrained from answering him, but strode outside and climbed into the trap. Trevor rushed after me. I said, you mentioned yesterday that 6 months ago, shortly after the brothers disappeared, you locked the outbuildings on the eastern fringes of the estate. This I did. but I hardly see. Get your men to open every one, and search them thoroughly. Time is of the essence." We returned to the house, and Trevor ordered his men to do as I willed. He distributed keys, and we once again boarded the trap and made for the eastern sector. 15 minutes later, we heard a cry from a native worker not 200 yards distant. He was standing with a crowd of other men outside the double doors of a storage shed. They stared into the dark interior, seemingly too fearful to enter. We hurried across and approached the shed, and the noisome stench that assailed my nostrils confirmed my gravest fears. Covering our lower faces with kerchiefs, we cautiously entered the storage shed. 2 bodies, dressed in tropical garb, were sprawled out across the floor. The heat of the shed had advanced their decay past the point of easy recognition. Trevor gagged and retched and hurried outside. "I swear," he said at last, "I swear to bring to justice the dogs responsible for this." "Look no farther than the 2 men lying dead," said I. "What?" he cried. "Trevor, my friend, there were never any kidnappers, except in the wily imaginings of the brothers' minds. This is indeed a tragic business." "Do you mean to say—" He gestured at the corpses of his erstwhile friends, speechless. "They manufactured the whole sorry business, Trevor," I said. "They had gambling debts. Their estate was failing. They took the coward's way out and came up with this disastrous plan to extract from you the £5,000. Of course they would never have reimbursed you. They planned to take the money and leave behind them their debts and the failed estate, leave in disguise by the ship to Calcutta, and start a new life with their criminal gains. Of course, they were thwarted by ill luck. They were not to know that Anya would fall ill, or that you would happen by this shed and inadvertently lock them inside. These buildings are sturdy constructs. They had no hope of escape." "Good God," Trevor cried, stricken. "Their cries, those banshee wails reported by the workers, it was this detail that made me suspicious," said I. "I am a man of science, Trevor. I have no truck with ghosts and ghouls and such." Taken together with all the other small details of this case, the brothers' gambling debts, the failing estate, the tickets booked for Calcutta, and Enya's unforeseen illness, I began to see what tragedy might have occurred. I left him pondering these terrible circumstances and made my way to the trap. At length Trevor hurried after me. "But one thing puzzles me," said he. "You said that 2 tickets were booked for Calcutta. And yet Anya says that William promised that together they would head for India to start new life." I paused in the process of climbing into the trap and stared Trevor directly in the eye. "There are 2 scenarios we can deduce from the facts as we know them," I said. "1. That William would indeed honor his professed love for Anya. Once they had picked up the ransom money, Bruce would leave the island by some other means, and William would spirit Anya off to India. And the other, I said, is that William and Bruce were not the gentlemen you assumed. That they booked tickets for the 2 of them and planned to leave Anya here while they escaped with your £5,000. And which," asked Trevor, "do you suppose is the truth?" I made a hopeless gesture. I would like to think, for Anya's peace of mind, that William intended to take her with him. Trevor stared into the heavens, his countenance racked by anguish. "Whichever," said he, "the company cannot have the truth of the matter spread far and wide. The scandal. You must promise me, Holmes, that your lips are sealed." "My friend," said I, "you have my assurance that I will breathe a word of the matter to no one." Mr. Sherlock Holmes paused to refill his pipe. There the matter ended. And, but for this letter, the details of the case might never have been known. What did Trevor tell the company? Holmes inclined his aquiline head. I advised him to destroy the spurious ransom note and concoct a tale whereby the brothers went one morning to check the storage shed, were bitten by a snake or some such, and succumbed before they might summon help. Their bodies were accidentally locked in the shed. Thus the tragedy went undiscovered for 6 long months. "And what became of Enya?" he inquired. "Ever the romantic, Watson." Holmes smiled at me. When I returned in '94, Enya was working for Trevor on his estate, and her son was a fit and healthy 6-year-old. I even, you will be astonished to learn, left a certain sum in trust to go towards the upbringing and education of the boy. His eyes twinkled at me as he reached for the bottle. "Would you care for another brandy, Watson?" he asked.